A poor and hungry girl approaches a millionaire eating outside a restaurant and says to him, "If you give me your leftovers, I'll tell you a secret." He was about to ignore her, but decided to play along with what he thought was a child's game. What she said next made his blood run cold. The autumn light, pale and melancholic, poured through the large windows of La Finestra, painting long shadows across the immaculately white tablecloths. For Arthur Hayes, the world had lost its color exactly 1 year ago, and this Sunday was just another gray canvas in his faded existence. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of laughter and promises, was now a mausoleum of memories. Seated at the same corner table, Eliza's favorite, he stared at the empty chair across from him, a vacuum that echoed the hole in his chest. The rich aroma of espresso, which once invigorated him, now only brought back the memory of her, of the way she held the cup with both hands, as if to absorb all the warmth in the world. His plate, a saffron risotto that was her favorite, remained untouched, the fork turning idly between his fingers, creating small furrows in the creamy surface. He remembered that last day with a painful clarity. Eliza had worn a sky-blue dress, the color of her eyes when she smiled. They had come to celebrate a new contract for the company, a triumph that now seemed hollow and meaningless. She spoke with excitement about plans for the charitable foundation he had helped her create, her gestures lively and full of passion. And then the pause, the hand to her chest, the look of confusion, the soft sigh before the silence. The doctors said it was sudden, a massive heart attack, a treacherous failure in a heart that had seemed so full of life. Unforeseeable, painless, they assured him. But the pain left behind was unbearable, a burden Arthur carried with every step, every breath. His best friend and business partner, David Carter, had been his rock, the only pillar that kept him standing amidst the collapse. David had organized everything, handled the bureaucracy, shielded him from the press's curiosity. David had been there every day with a supportive shoulder and words of comfort. A subtle movement to his right broke the spell of his melancholy. A small, almost ethereal figure materialized beside his table. It was a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with large, frightened eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of a lifetime of hardship. Her clothes were frayed, and a tear in the knee of her jeans revealed skin smudged with soot. She regarded him not with the petulance of a child asking for candy, but with a solemn seriousness that disarmed him. For a moment, Arthur felt a pang of the generosity that had made him known for his philanthropy. He would call the waiter, order a full meal for her, but before he could form the words, the girl took a step closer, her voice a fragile whisper, almost inaudible amid the restaurant's murmur. "Mister," she said, her eyes fixed on the golden risotto, "if you give me your leftovers, I'll tell you a secret about the pretty lady who was with you here." Arthur's blood ran cold. It was not an ordinary request. The specificity of the phrase, "the pretty lady who was with you here," hit him like a punch. How could this child know he used to come here with someone? How could she connect him to that empty chair? Intrigue sliced through his grief. He looked at the untouched plate, then at the girl's hungry, expectant eyes. Something in her posture, a restrained urgency, compelled him. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The girl leaned across the table, the scent of dust and the street mingling with the aroma of coffee. Her warm breath touched his ear as she whispered the words that would shatter his world, that would transform the ache of grief into an unimaginable terror. "It wasn't her heart that stopped," the childish voice trembled, laced with a terrifying certainty. "It was the man who always comes here with you. I saw him put a white powder in the pretty lady's coffee." Arthur's world, which until then had been spinning slowly on its axis of pain, came to a sudden halt. The girl's words, a fragile whisper, echoed in his mind with the force of a thunderclap, shattering the respectful silence of his sorrow. For an instant, he felt a surge of rage. A cruel child, perhaps, inventing a macabre story to get a plate of food. How dare she profane Eliza's memory with such a vile fantasy? His first impulse was to send her away, to protect the sanctuary of his memories from this absurd accusation. David, the man who had wept beside him, who had held him up when his own legs buckled at the funeral. It was unthinkable, a betrayal of the very logic of grief and friendship. He opened his mouth to scold her, to tell her it was a terrible lie, but the girl's eyes stopped him. In them was a genuine fear, but also an unshakable conviction. She seemed to sense his disbelief, the wall of denial he was hastily erecting in his mind. Before he could speak, she added, her voice even lower, as if sharing forbidden secrets. "The pretty lady wore a blue dress," she said, "a light blue, the color of the sky before it rains. And she smelled like flowers, like jasmine." Arthur held his breath. The dress. He remembered the light fabric, how the color enhanced the sparkle in Eliza's eyes. And the perfume. Jasmine was her favorite. These were intimate details, fragments of a day that only he and she had shared. The girl continued, her memory a precise and painful archive. She ordered that coffee with the foam and a little bit of sweet syrup. The man with the mustache always brought it to her, and she started to feel sick when the big church bell rang 3 times, and then, one more, 3:30, the exact time. A chill ran down Arthur's spine. He had completely forgotten the detail of the caramel in Eliza's macchiato, a little indulgence she loved. How could this child, a stranger from the streets, know all of this? They were pieces of a puzzle that fit no narrative but hers. The anger gave way to an icy confusion, a seed of doubt sprouting in the fertile soil of his pain and vulnerability. He looked at the girl's small, serious face, and for the first time saw not an opportunist, but a messenger of a terrible truth. With a trembling hand, he motioned for the waiter and asked him to pack up the risotto, adding a juice and a dessert. "For my little friend here," he said, his voice hoarse. He turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She hesitated, her wide eyes blinking. "Leah," she finally whispered. "Where do you live, Leah?" She just made a vague gesture toward the bustling street. Around. Arthur understood that she had no home, that her existence was as precarious as the truth she carried. He handed her the warm package. "Thank you, Leah," he said. "This is very important." Their fingers brushed, and he felt the cold skin of her hand. As she walked away, clutching the food like a treasure, Arthur felt his world tilt dangerously. The familiar pain of grief was being replaced by something new and sharp. Fear. The fear that his sorrow was not the work of chance, but of a calculated betrayal. His cell phone vibrated on the table, jolting him from his thoughts. The name on the screen glowed like a warning. "David," he answered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Arthur? Buddy, it's me, just calling to see how you are. You sound distant. Is everything okay?" David's voice, so familiar and comforting, for months now sounded like a strange and dissonant noise through the phone. Every word of concern now seemed coated in a layer of falsehood that Arthur could no longer ignore. "I'm fine, David, just a tough day, you know," he managed to reply, forcing a weary tone that wasn't entirely feigned, though the cause was different. He felt as if he were acting in a play, a cruel farce where he was the only one who didn't know the script. "Of course, man. I get it. Remember, I'm here for whatever you need. Don't hesitate to call any time. Maybe we can grab dinner this week to clear your head." The invitation, which would have once been a balm, now sounded like a trap. Dinner with the man who might have... No. He couldn't complete the thought. It was too monstrous. "I'll see, David. I'll call you," Arthur said, his throat tight, ending the call before his voice betrayed him completely. He dropped the phone on the table as if it burned his hand. Alone again, the restaurant's silence swallowed him. The doubt planted by Leah flowered in his chest like a poisonous weed, choking all his certainties. He tried to rationalize. Leah was a street kid, likely traumatized, perhaps with a fertile imagination that mixed fragments of conversations she overheard. But the details, the sky blue dress, the caramel macchiato, the exact time, they were facts, facts that only someone who had been there could know. He closed his eyes, trying to remember that day, searching every corner of his memory. David hadn't been there. He was sure of it. He would have seen him. Or would he? His grief was a dense fog, obscuring everything. Maybe David was at another table. Maybe he came and left without Arthur noticing. But if he was, why had he never mentioned it? Why let Arthur believe he was alone in that fateful moment, when his best friend might have been just a few feet away? The omission was what screamed. A silent alarm in his mind. An urgent need to act took hold of him, a cold clarity that cut through the fog of grief. He needed proof, a starting point, something concrete to hold on to amid the vertigo of his suspicions. He stood up, leaving cash on the table, and walked with firm steps toward the manager's desk. Marco, the manager of La Finestra for over a decade, greeted him with a sad, respectful smile. "Mr. Hayes, I'm so sorry for your loss. It's good, even under sad circumstances, to see you again." Arthur forced a smile back. "Marco, thank you. I need a small favor. I'm organizing some old papers and need to verify an expense. Would you have the reservation records from October 1st of last year?" The excuse was flimsy but plausible. Marco frowned thoughtfully. "It's an unusual request, sir, but for you, of course. I'll check our old system. One moment." Time seemed to stretch as Marco typed on an old computer in the back office. Each click of the keyboard was a beat of Arthur's already racing heart. Arthur stared at the screen, trying to decipher the lines of text that appeared, and then Marco turned the screen toward him. "Here it is, sir. The log for that day. Your reservation for 2 at 2 o'clock. Arthur scanned the list. David's name wasn't there. A momentary relief washed over him, but it was quickly crushed by a subsequent thought. What if he didn't have a reservation? "Marco," he said, his voice controlled, "could you check the credit card payment list from that day? Maybe a business lunch I forgot to log." Marco, ever helpful, accessed another file. The list appeared in chronological order. Arthur's eyes scanned down it, the names of vendors, of other patrons. And then he saw it. At 3:47 p.m., 15 minutes after Eliza had been taken away by the ambulance, a payment. The name on the card was unmistakable: David Carter. He had been there. He had been there and never said a word. The omission was not forgetfulness. It was a silent confession, and the ground beneath Arthur's feet, already fragile, finally gave way. The image of David's name on the computer screen burned itself onto Arthur's retina. 15 minutes. He had been there, mere feet away, for almost an hour, and he had watched. He watched the panic, the arrival of the ambulance, Arthur's despair, and chose to remain invisible. The lie by omission was sharper than any spoken falsehood. It was a cold, calculated betrayal. He had paid his bill and left, letting Arthur sink alone into the tragedy, only to re-emerge later as the comforting angel. The duality of the act was so perverse that Arthur felt nausea rise in his throat. He thanked Marco in a voice he barely recognized as his own and walked out of the restaurant, the cold afternoon air hitting his face like a slap. He needed to breathe, to think, but his mind was a whirlwind of images. Eliza's smile, David's concerned face, the white powder Leah had described. The pieces were fitting together with terrifying precision. In the days that followed, paranoia began to set in. Every call from David, every text message asking how he was, felt like a sadistic taunt. Arthur replied in monosyllables, making excuses not to see him, feeling like an imposter in his own life. The grief had morphed into a different kind of agony, a constant vigilance, a fear that left him sleepless. He felt hunted in his own home. To the world, he was the young philanthropic millionaire plunged into a dignified sorrow. But inside, he was a haunted man, desperately trying to discern truth from madness. Was he losing his mind? Was grief causing him to build castles of suspicion on the word of a hungry child? He needed more. He needed something that couldn't be disputed. His search led him back to Leah. He spent 2 full days combing the streets around La Finestra, his heart aching with every child he saw, fearing he had imagined her. Finally, late in the afternoon on the 2nd day, he found her sitting on the steps of a closed library, sketching on a piece of cardboard with a shard of charcoal. She looked up as he approached, not with fear, but with quiet recognition. He sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "Leah," he said softly, "I need your help again." She didn't reply, just kept drawing. He could see they were faces, drawn with a skill surprising for her age. "You have a good memory for faces, don't you?" he asked. She finally stopped and looked at him. "I remember everything, who's good and who's bad." Arthur's heart beat faster. He took his phone from his pocket and with trembling hands pulled up a photo. It was taken at a company event, months before Eliza's death. In it, Arthur and David were standing side by side, smiling for the camera. He showed the photo to the girl. "Leah, do you remember the man who was with me that day in the restaurant? The one you told me about? Do you recognize him in this picture?" Leah leaned in to look at the screen, her large, serious eyes scanning the image. She didn't hesitate. Her small, charcoal-smudged finger pointed directly at David's smiling face. "That's him," she said with absolute certainty, "the man who doesn't smile with his eyes." The description was so accurate, so intuitive, that a shiver ran down Arthur's spine. But then Leah added something that left him petrified. He had a big, shiny ring on his right hand. He opened the ring over the pretty lady's coffee. It had a little hole inside. A ring. Arthur searched his memory. David always wore a gold signet ring, a family heirloom, he'd said. A large, showy ring. But one with a secret compartment? It sounded like something out of a spy movie. It sounded like fantasy. "Leah, are you sure? A ring that opens," he pressed, trying to stay calm. In response, Leah took her piece of cardboard, flipped it over, and with quick, precise strokes began to draw. It wasn't a child's scribble. It was a detailed, frighteningly accurate sketch of a man's hand wearing a signet ring. And in the drawing, the top of the ring was hinged, slightly open, revealing a small cavity. It was David's ring, and the image of that ring, open over Eliza's cup, was the piece that turned a terrible suspicion into a horrifying possibility. Leah's drawing wasn't just evidence. It was a verdict. The precision of the details, the child's visual memory, transcended any logical explanation other than the truth. Arthur looked at the sketch on the dirty cardboard and saw not just a ring, but the murder weapon. The mental image that formed was so vivid and nauseating that he had to force himself to take a deep breath to keep from collapsing right there on the sidewalk. He gave Leah all the cash he had in his wallet, insisting she buy food and something warm to wear. "And please, Leah, be careful. Don't talk to strangers about this, about any of this," he urged, the urgency in his voice making the girl nod gravely. Watching her disappear into the crowd with her cardboard treasure in hand stirred an overwhelming sense of responsibility in Arthur. This child wasn't just a witness, she was a target, and he was now her only protector. Back in his apartment, which felt more like a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city, Arthur felt more imprisoned than ever. The truth was a cage, and he was trapped inside it with a monster he once called his friend. How could he confront? "David, my best friend, did you murder my wife with a poison ring so you could comfort me afterward?" The accusation was so insane, he would have doubted his own sanity. He needed more than a child's testimony and a credit card transaction. He needed something irrefutable, something the police couldn't dismiss as the delusions of a grieving man. The security cameras. The solution seemed so obvious, he cursed himself for not thinking of it sooner. La Finestra was a high-end establishment. It would certainly have a robust surveillance system. The next day, he returned to the restaurant, this time with a more elaborate excuse. He told Marco, the manager, a story about losing a tie pin, of great sentimental value, a gift from Eliza, and that he believed he had lost it during that last lunch. "I know it's a long shot, Marco, but it would mean the world to me if we could check the footage from that day, just of our section of the dining room." Marco, as always, was sympathetic to his grief. "Of course, Mr. Hayes, I'll do what I can. Our system stores recordings for 18 months. I'll have our IT guy pull the archives for that date." Hope flickered in Arthur for the first time in days. There it would be, the image of David approaching the table, the subtle gesture, the ring. It would all be there, in high definition. The wait for the recordings was torture. Arthur spent 2 days jumping at every phone call, every email notification. Finally, Marco's call came, but the manager's tone wasn't one of success. It was apologetic. "Mr. Hayes, I have terrible news. I'm so sorry, but it seems there was a technical glitch during that exact period. All the recordings for the week of October 1st last year were corrupted. The technician said it was a rare hard drive failure. The files are lost, completely unrecoverable." The silence that followed on the phone was heavy. Lost, corrupted, a rare failure. The coincidence was so absurdly convenient, it was impossible to swallow. An entire week of footage gone, precisely the week he needed. Arthur felt the floor disappear from under him once again. It wasn't bad luck, it was sabotage. And who would know about the security system's existence and flaws better than an extremely frequent patron? David knew La Finestra as well as he did. He knew the blind spots, knew who to bribe, knew how to erase his tracks. The missing tapes weren't the loss of proof. They were confirmation of a plan. A meticulous plan, executed with a coldness that chilled his soul. The paranoia that had been a whisper now screamed in his mind. He wasn't just dealing with a murderer, he was dealing with a ghost, someone who could manipulate reality, erase the past, and hide in plain sight. And worst of all, this ghost held the key to his company, his home, and, until that moment, his deepest trust. The battle wouldn't be for physical evidence. It would be a war of nerves. The revelation of the sabotage security cameras ignited a new kind of fire in Arthur. The passivity of grief gave way to a cold, sharp determination. If he couldn't prove what David did, maybe he could prove what he used to do it. The white powder. Leah's words echoed in his mind. Was it possible that, a year later, there was still a trace? It was a remote, almost desperate hope, but it was all he had. He began his silent investigation of Eliza's belongings, which he had kept untouched in a guest room, a shrine to her memory that he now had to desecrate in search of the truth. Wearing latex gloves, he began to meticulously examine the clothes she had worn that day, the sky blue dress, the light coat. Nothing. He went through her handbag, an object he could barely touch without being flooded by a wave of pain. Inside, he found her lipstick, her wallet, a paperback novel. At the bottom, in a small side pocket, his fingers found something small and hard. It was the coffee cup, not the one from the restaurant, but a small porcelain cup she had bought that very morning at an antique fair. She had been carrying it in her bag, wrapped in a scarf, excited to show it to him. The memory hit him with force. Eliza never got the chance to drink from the restaurant's cup. In the middle of their conversation, thrilled with her new purchase, she had poured her macchiato into her own cup, admiring how the white foam contrasted with the old porcelain. The detail, once insignificant, was now monumental. The murder weapon wasn't at La Finestra, it was here in his hands. With surgical care, he placed the cup in a makeshift evidence bag and, using contacts his wealth afforded him, sent it for a discreet forensic analysis at a private lab, claiming it was for an environmental contamination test on a family heirloom. While he waited for the results, the pressure from David mounted. He called more frequently, his voice always laced, with a concern that now sounded to Arthur like a jailer checking his cell. "Buddy, you don't look well. People at the office are talking. You're pale, distracted. Maybe it's time to take a longer vacation. Let me handle things for a while." The suggestion was coated in false altruism, but the intent was clear. To push him away, isolate him, take control. Arthur felt the walls closing in, David's web tightening around him. His only source of clarity was Leah. He met her every 2 days, in the same spot, bringing food, warm clothes, and most importantly, talking. He discovered she was incredibly smart, observant, and carried an old sadness in her eyes. She spoke little of her past, only that her mother went to the stars. One day, while eating a sandwich he'd brought her, she suddenly tensed. "There are bad men watching me," she whispered without moving her head. "They told me not to make up stories, to forget things I don't understand." Arthur's heart plummeted. They had found her. David, or whoever was working with him, knew about the witness. The threat was no longer just against him. It was direct, explicit, against a defenseless child. Arthur's paranoia morphed into a fierce, protective fear. He could no longer leave her on the streets. That same night, he convinced her to come with him, taking her to a small, secure apartment he kept for emergencies, a place not even David knew about. As he was settling her into the guest room, Arthur's phone rang. It was the lab. The results were in. With Leah sleeping safely in the next room, he opened the email, his hands sweating. The report was complex, full of chemical terms, but the conclusion was crystal clear. Microscopic traces of a rare alkaloid, derived from an exotic plant, had been found. A substance that, in concentrated doses, induced severe cardiac arrhythmia, perfectly mimicking the symptoms of a massive heart attack. And its most notable feature, it decomposed almost completely in the body in under 12 hours, leaving no trace in a standard autopsy. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was science. The scientific confirmation was like a solid rock in Arthur's sea of uncertainty. He now had proof of the poison, the invisible weapon. Leah's word was no longer a child's fantasy. It was testimony corroborated by forensic data. The image of David, the friend, the confidant, crumbled completely, replaced by that of a patient, calculating predator. The grief for his wife now mingled with a new kind of pain, grief for the friendship he had believed to be the most solid of his life. Every shared memory, every laugh, every moment of support was now stained, rewritten in the sinister light of betrayal. Arthur's genuine generosity, his tendency to trust blindly, had been the weapon used against him. He felt like a fool, naive, blind. While Arthur processed this new, terrible reality, David made his boldest move yet. He called an emergency meeting of the company's board, of which Arthur was the majority shareholder. Arthur, sensing the trap, attended. In the cold, impersonal boardroom, surrounded by faces that were once familiar and friendly, he felt like a defendant at his own trial. David, with an expression of deep sorrow and concern, took the floor. He spoke of Arthur's fragile emotional state, his inability to make important decisions, his worrying detachment from the business since Eliza's death, He painted a picture of a broken man, lost in his grief, a danger to the stability of the company they had built together. "It is with a heavy heart," David said, looking at each board member, "that I suggest a compulsory medical leave for Arthur. And, to ensure the continuity of our projects, I propose to temporarily assume full control of operations as interim CEO." It was then that he distributed the documents. They were assessments from psychologists whom Arthur had never met, manipulated performance reports, and, most shockingly, a legal power of attorney prepared months prior that would grant him sweeping powers over company assets in Arthur's absence. The plan was clear, and it had been in motion for a long time. Eliza's death had not been an isolated act of cruelty. It was the first and most crucial step in a corporate coup. Eliminating the beloved wife was the key to destabilizing the husband and seizing his empire. Arthur remained silent throughout the entire speech, watching David's face. He no longer saw his friend, but a stranger wearing a mask of compassion. David's arrogance was his weakness. He underestimated Arthur, saw only the gentle, grieving man, not the cold fury growing inside him. When David finished, all eyes turned to Arthur, expecting an outburst, a denial, perhaps tears. But Arthur just looked at David and said, with a calmness that surprised everyone in the room, including himself, "You've prepared this very carefully, David. It's impressive. I need some time to think." He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The battle was no longer just for Eliza's memory or Leah's protection. It was now for his own survival, for his company, for his legacy. That night in the safe apartment, as he watched Leah sleep, a peaceful sleep she hadn't had in a long time, Arthur made a decision. He couldn't go to the police yet. The word of a street girl and a privately obtained forensic report against a respected businessman like David. It would be his word against his, and David had already laid the groundwork to discredit him as mentally unstable. He needed something bigger. He needed to understand the why on a scale no one could ignore. He hired a private investigator, a discreet and efficient ex-cop with a single instruction: investigate David Carter. Not his finances, not his business deals, his personal life. Specifically, his social connections to other businessmen and their wives. He had a terrible feeling, a suspicion that Eliza was not the first. The weeks that followed were a tense game of appearances. In public and at the company, Arthur adopted the persona David had created for him, that of a fragile man, gradually ceding control to his concerned friend. He agreed to the leave, delegated responsibilities, and watched with contained fury as David settled into his office, savoring a victory he believed was complete. Every sympathetic smile from David, every pat on the back, was like acid on his skin. But behind this facade of submission, Arthur operated in the shadows, moving the pieces on his own board. Every night, he met with the private investigator, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Matthias, who brought him pieces of an increasingly dark puzzle. The first piece arrived a week later. Matthias discovered that 3 years prior, the wife of a real estate magnate, a competitor David and Arthur had been trying to acquire, had died suddenly. Cause of death on record: massive heart attack. The woman was 42, with no history of heart problems. 6 months later, the widower, devastated and unable to manage his business, sold his company for a fraction of its value. The buyer? David and Arthur's corporation, in a deal aggressively spearheaded by David. An icy chill ran down Arthur's spine. It was a disturbing coincidence. The second piece arrived a few days later, even more sinister. Matthias unearthed a case from 5 years back. The wife of a brilliant tech inventor whose patent David coveted had also passed away unexpectedly. The official cause, once again, was a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. The inventor, consumed by grief, abandoned his projects, and the patent was eventually acquired by a secret consortium, to which Matthias managed to trace an indirect financial link to David. The pattern was becoming undeniable. This wasn't just about corporate power, it was a predatory, murderous strategy. David wasn't a traitor, he was a serial predator, using grief and sorrow as business tools. Eliza hadn't been the primary target. She was just an obstacle. Collateral. Damage on the path to the real prize, Arthur's empire. The revelation transformed Arthur's personal pain into an overwhelming responsibility. There were other victims, other families destroyed by the same cruelty. He wasn't just seeking justice for Eliza. He was seeking justice for all of them. Meanwhile, his relationship with Leah deepened. In the confinement of the safe apartment, he discovered a child of extraordinary resilience and intelligence. She learned to read with astonishing speed, devouring the books he brought her. She asked insightful questions about the world, and her smile, when it appeared, was like a ray of sunshine in Arthur's darkness. She reminded him of the purpose of his fight. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that the biggest revelation of all came to light. Not from Matthias, but from Leah herself. Arthur was showing her old photos on his tablet, trying to give her glimpses of a normal life. He swiped to a picture of Eliza, smiling at a picnic. Leah looked at the photo for a long time. "She looks like my mom," she said, her voice low and thick with emotion. Arthur looked at her, confused. "Your mom, Leah? You told me she went to the stars." Leah nodded, her eyes welling up. "She was a pretty lady too, and she got sick all of a sudden too." With his heart in his throat, Arthur asked her to describe her mother. As Leah spoke, describing a woman with dark hair and a kind smile who worked as a secretary at a big company, Arthur felt the ground disappear. He had Matthias cross-reference the details with the tech inventor's case. The answer came back in under an hour and hit him with the force of a hurricane. The inventor's wife, the woman who had died of sudden cardiac arrhythmia 5 years prior, was named Helen. And she had a young daughter who vanished from the records after her mother's death, presumably taken into a foster care system from which she eventually ran away. The daughter's name was Caroline, but everyone called her Leah. The little girl he had saved wasn't a random witness. She was the orphaned daughter of another of David's victims, a survivor who, by some inexplicable instinct, had sought him out to avenge not only Eliza, but her own mother. The revelation that Leah was the daughter of another of David's victims reconfigured Arthur's entire universe. Their meeting at the restaurant had not been a fluke of fate, a fortunate coincidence. It had been the result of a search. Leah, with the instinctual wisdom of a survivor, had spent months, perhaps years, watching, waiting. She had recognized in Arthur the same pain she had felt, the same kind of sudden, inexplicable loss. Her approach had not been just a plea for food. It was an act of alliance, a cry for help and justice cast across the chasm of their shared tragedies. He looked at the girl, now asleep on the sofa, curled around a book, and felt a wave of protective love as fierce and overwhelming as the grief he had felt for Eliza. She was no longer just a witness to be protected. She was a legacy. The last living part of a woman who, like Eliza, had been erased by David's ambition. This new connection gave Arthur the strength he had been lacking. His mission now had a face, a future to be secured. He and Matthias intensified their investigation, working against the clock as they sensed that David, growing more comfortable in his new position of power, might begin to erase his tracks more permanently. Arthur's paranoia, once a torment, became a sharp tool. He started noticing things: an unfamiliar car parked on his street for days on end, strange clicks on his phone line, the feeling of being followed. David was no longer just observing him, he was surveilling him. He knew something was wrong. Arthur's passivity was unnatural, and the suspicion of a predator like David was sharp. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Matthias, digging through David's offshore finances, discovered a pattern of payments to a private security firm with a shady reputation. The same firm that coincidentally provided IT services to La Finestra. The final piece of the missing security tape puzzle clicked into place, but it was one specific payment that caught Matthias's eye, a large deposit made 3 days before an accident was planned for Arthur and Leah. Accident? Arthur asked, his blood running cold. David is planning something, Matthias said, his voice grave. He's not going to settle for just pushing you out of the company. He knows you're a loose end, and now he must suspect the girl too. You're both a risk he's not willing to take. Fear, for the first time, became palpable, a physical, imminent threat. It was no longer about stocks and power of attorney, it was about life and death. David, sensing the net closing in, was about to act decisively. His plan revealed itself the following night. Arthur had received an invitation to a charity gala, an event he and Eliza had always supported. He initially declined, but Matthias convinced him to go. It's the perfect bait. He'll expect you to be there, away from home, away from the girl. They set a plan. Arthur would go to the event, but slip out a back door minutes after arriving, while a body double hired by Matthias would remain in his place, securing his alibi. While Arthur was on his way to the event, the real attack happened. A gas leak was faked at the safe apartment, where Leah was under the care of a trusted female ex-cop hired by Matthias. The plan was clear: an explosion, a tragic accident that would eliminate the only eyewitness and possibly frame Arthur for negligence, destroying his reputation for good. But Matthias and his team were prepared. They intercepted the maintenance crew sent by David's security firm and apprehended them before they could do any damage. When Arthur, his heart in his throat, got the call from Matthias confirming Leah was safe and the attackers had been caught, relief was followed by an icy fury. David had crossed the final line. He had tried to kill a child. The silent war was over. It was time for the final confrontation. Arthur knew he couldn't just hand the captured men over to the police. They were just pawns. He needed the king, and he knew instinctively that the only way to bring David down was to use his own arrogance and his contempt for Arthur and Leah against him. The trap had to be psychological, a shattering of his facade of control, and he had the perfect bait, the courage of a little girl with nothing left to lose. The plan was risky, an all-or-nothing gamble that put Leah at the center of the danger, but it was the only way. Arthur spent hours talking with her, explaining not the sordid details, but the essence of the situation. He didn't treat her like a child, but like a partner, an ally. Leah, the bad man, David, he thinks you're just a scared little girl. He thinks your memories are fantasies. He thinks he can trick us, Arthur said, kneeling before her, holding her small hands. But we know the truth. Do you have the courage to show him he's wrong? Leah's eyes, which had seen so much, did not waver. In them was a determination that mirrored Arthur's. For my mom, and for Eliza, she replied, her voice firm. I'm not afraid of him. The trap was set at the place where it all began. La Finestra. Arthur called David, his voice filled with a manufactured panic. David, I need to see you now. It's about that girl, the street kid. She's shown up again. She's saying horrible things, crazy things about you, about Eliza. I'm at the restaurant. She's here with me. I don't know what to do. I think I'm losing my mind. The police will think I'm insane. The bait was Arthur's vulnerability, something David had always exploited. The chance to personally silence the source of his problems while simultaneously solidifying the narrative of Arthur's mental instability was irresistible to such an arrogant man. David agreed to come immediately, the tone of his voice a mix of feigned concern and ill-disguised triumph. The restaurant was nearly empty late at night. Arthur and Leah sat at the same corner table. Matthias and his team were disguised as patrons and staff with discreet microphones and cameras recording every angle. Arthur could feel his heart pounding, a primal fear for Leah's safety. He wanted to call it all off, to hide her away and run. But then he looked at her. Leah was sitting straight, her chin up, a queen on her small throne, awaiting the dragon. Her courage anchored him. David arrived, his face a mask of compassion. He sat down, ignoring Leah and focusing on Arthur. "Arthur, my friend, what's going on? You need to calm down." Arthur played his part, stammering, appearing desperate. "She won't stop, David. She makes up stories. About a ring, about a powder." David finally looked at Leah, the contempt in his eyes barely veiled. "Child," he said with a cold condescension, "sometimes, when bad things happen, our minds create stories to protect us. You're confused. What you think you saw isn't real." It was then that Leah spoke, her voice clear and steady. "I don't think I saw. I saw." She looked directly into David's eyes. "I saw the ring. It had an eagle on it, and it opened. You opened it over the pretty lady's coffee. The white powder fell out like dirty snow." The mention of the eagle, a detail of the family signet she had never mentioned to Arthur, made David flinch for a split second, a nearly imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He recovered quickly, laughing it off. "Quite the imagination. Arthur, she's clearly delusional. It's the trauma speaking. She needs professional help, not an audience." Arthur then played his final card. "Maybe you're right, David. Maybe it's all a fantasy." He turned to Leah. "Leah, maybe you were mistaken. The police would never believe you against a man like Mr. Carter." Then he looked back at David, his eyes full of feigned pain. "She's just a child, David. She doesn't understand what she's doing. Please just make her stop. I'll do anything. I'll sign the papers. I'll disappear. Just make this story go away. Tell her it was a mistake." David's arrogance blinded him. He saw total victory, Arthur's complete surrender. He leaned across the table, his face close to Leah's, his voice a venomous whisper, believing he was speaking only to a foolish child and a broken man. "Listen to me, little girl. Smart people know when to keep their mouth shut. You saw nothing. The ring doesn't open. There was no powder. The pretty lady just got tired and went to sleep forever. And if you keep telling your little stories, maybe you'll get tired and go to sleep forever too. Understand?" Every word was a confession, a threat, captured on high-quality audio and video. The king had fallen into his own trap, condemned by his own voice. The instant David's words hung in the air, laden with venom and threat, the atmosphere in La Finestra shifted. The ensuing silence was heavy, dense, broken only by the soft click of the kitchen door opening. David, still leaning over the table, sensed a change in the air before he saw it. His triumphant smile froze and shattered as he saw Matthias, no longer in disguise, emerge from the shadows, followed by two uniformed police officers who had been sitting at a nearby table. Understanding hit David's face like a shockwave, replacing arrogance with a pale, disbelieving panic. His eyes shot from Matthias to Arthur, and for the first time he saw the man across from him, not the broken, grieving friend, but a cold, calculating, and victorious opponent. Arthur's mask of compassion fell away, revealing the steel beneath. "Understand, David?" Arthur asked, echoing David's own threatening question, his voice calm but sharp as glass. "Every word, recorded, just like your attempt to blow up the apartment with Leah inside. Your pawns are already singing like canaries." David opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to threaten, but no sound came out. He was cornered, his web of lies and manipulation undone in a single devastating moment. The police officers approached. The table, their movements professional and unhurried. "David Carter, you're under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, among other charges, to be detailed at the station," one of the officers said, the flat official voice sealing his fate. As the handcuffs clicked around David's wrists, his eyes met Leah's. The girl showed no fear, no triumph. She just stared at him with a quiet serenity, the tranquil strength of a soul that had endured the unthinkable and survived. In that gaze, David didn't see a child, but the face of all his victims, the embodiment of the justice he thought he had forever outsmarted. He was led away, a man stripped of his power and his facade, leaving behind only the echo of his betrayal. As the restaurant door closed, Arthur released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He turned to Leah, his body trembling with adrenaline and overwhelming relief. He wrapped her in his arms, a hug that was as much to protect her as it was to anchor himself to her. "It's over, Leah. It's over," he whispered into her hair. "You were so brave. Braver than anyone I've ever known." She nestled into his chest, and for the first time since he'd met her, he felt her relax completely, her small body finally allowing itself to feel safe. In the days and weeks that followed, the story came to light, not as a media scandal, but through the discreet legal channels that Arthur and Matthias ensured. The evidence was overwhelming. The recorded confession, the testimony of the captured men, the forensic reports, Matthias's investigation into the other deaths. Other families, who had lived for years with the pain of inexplicable loss, finally received answers. David's web of deceit was vast, and his crimes more heinous than Arthur had ever imagined. The company was restructured, the corrupt elements purged, and Arthur, though still bearing the scars, resumed his place, not with his former ambition, but with a new sense of purpose. The most important battle, however, took place far from courtrooms and boardrooms. It was the battle for a little girl's soul and the rebuilding of a life. Arthur began the legal process of becoming Leah's guardian, not out of obligation or pity, but out of a deep, genuine love. She was the light that had guided him through his darkest hour. She had given him a reason to fight when he had lost all others, and he, in turn, would give her what had been stolen: a home, security, an education, and above all, a family. He discovered that true wealth lay not in his corporate empire, but in Leah's laughter echoing through the halls of his apartment, in the way she held his hand, in the unshakable trust they had placed in each other. 7 weeks after that fateful night at La Finestra, Arthur's life was unrecognizable. The grief for Eliza still existed, a soft scar on his heart that would always remind him of the love they lost, but it was no longer the dominant force in his life. The sorrow had been tempered by gratitude and supplanted by a new, vibrant form of love. The final paperwork had arrived that morning. With a stroke of a pen, what their hearts already knew became official. He was Leah's father. Her last name was now Hayes. It wasn't a replacement, but an addition, a fusion of 2 broken lives into a new whole, stronger and more resilient. The orphaned street girl and the reclusive millionaire had found in each other what they both thought they had lost forever: a home. To celebrate, there was no grand party or extravagant event. Their celebration was quiet, intimate, and deeply meaningful. They returned to La Finestra. The place, once a mausoleum of pain and betrayal, needed to be redefined. It needed to become a symbol of their new beginning. As they entered, Marco, the manager, greeted them with a genuine, warm smile, without the shadow of pity that once marked his face. He led them not to the dark corner table, but to the best table in the restaurant by the window, where the afternoon sun streamed in, golden and promising. Leah, wearing a new dress, not sky blue, but a vibrant yellow that matched her personality, looked at everything with wide, wondrous eyes. Arthur asked for the menu and with a smile handed it to Leah. "Today, my daughter, you choose anything you want." She studied the words with the seriousness of a scholar, finally deciding on a pasta dish with cheese sauce and, for dessert, the largest chocolate sundae the restaurant could make. As they ate, not in melancholy silence, but amidst animated conversation, about books, stars, and what she wanted to be when she grew up, a mix of detective and artist, Arthur found himself just watching her. He saw in her her mother's intelligence, a survivor's resilience, and an innate kindness the world had not managed to extinguish. She had not only saved him from a deadly deception, she had saved him from himself, from the prison of his own grief. After dessert, Arthur called Marco over and had a private word with him. He made a generous donation to the restaurant on one condition. On a discreet wall near the entrance, he asked that a small brass plaque be placed, not with names to avoid sensationalism, but with a simple message: in memory of all souls whose light was extinguished too soon by the darkness of greed. May their remembrance be a beacon for truth and justice. La Finestra would no longer be just a meeting place, but a quiet memorial, a reminder that the truth, however painful, has the power to heal and transform. As they left the restaurant, hand in hand, the twilight bathed the city in hues of pink and orange. Leah stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at Arthur. "Dad," she said, the word still new and wonderful on her tongue. "Are Eliza and my mum together in the stars now, watching over us?" Arthur knelt to her level, his heart swelling with an emotion so intense it almost took his breath away. "I'm sure they are, my love, and I think they're very proud of us." He knew their journey had not erased the past, but honored it. The justice. For Eliza and Helen wasn't found in a prison cell, but in the happiness and safety of Leah, in the family they had built from the ashes of tragedy. The hungry girl who once traded a secret for leftovers had not only exposed a monster, but had also guided a lost man back to life, teaching him that true family is forged not by blood, but by the unbreakable bonds of mutual protection, courage, and love. And in this new beginning, they both found the sweetest redemption of all.